Before we talk about finding the inverse of this function, let's talk about what this function really means. So down here I have a visual representing a function machine that's going to show us what exactly this function f of x is doing. So if we put a number in, we call that x. So if whatever x value we put into our function, imagine that that number goes here, the first thing we're going to do is multiply it by 2. So that's what this means. Then we get a number, and then the last thing it does is we add 1/3 onto the end. This number that comes out, we call that f of x. So that's what this function machine is doing. Now, if we think about finding the inverse of a function, we're thinking about going through our function machine backwards. So now, let's say we put a number in at the end. If we want to undo this operation that's been done, think about what is the opposite of adding 1/3. It'll be subtracting 1/3. Then if we want to undo multiplying by 2, we will divide by 2. And the rule for going backwards through the function machine is called the inverse. We also use special notation for inverse. So it sort of looks like f of x, but we're going to put a little -1 here. The -1 almost looks like an exponent, but it's not. It's just notation to say this is the inverse of whatever this original function was, f of x. So if we think of for the inverse function, the x value in the inverse function would be whatever's going in at the end. Whatever comes out would be the f inverse value. So the first thing we do with this x value is we subtract 1/3, like that, and then we take that whole answer and we divide it by 2. So this would be one way to write that. We could sort of change our format a little bit by dividing each individual piece by 2. So x divided by 2 and 1/3 divided by 2. 1/3 divided by 2 is actually 1/6, which makes sense if you think about a third of a pizza being cut in half. Then it would be 1/6. Also, x divided by 2, we could rewrite that as 1/2 in front, 1/2 times x. 1/3 divided by 2 is 1/6, so that would be another format for getting our inverse function equation. Okay, we can also follow a more formal process for getting the inverse. The first step would be so going back to the original equation, to the original f of x, the first step is to replace f of x with y. So we have y equals 2x plus 1/3. Second step is to switch x and y. Our third step then is to solve for y. So notice how if we're solving for y, same for first step. First we have to subtract 1/3 from both sides. And then the last step of being able to get y by itself is we need to divide both sides by 2. And notice how here we are at the same place as we were before when we just thought about working through our function machine backwards. And again, this can simplify down to that for a little bit more formal version of our inverse function. And also, so I should say then the final step, so notice how we have a y here. The final step then can be replacing y using this inverse notation with a little -1.